escape artist.
But how do you relate to the modernist situation like that? I mean, it's like, we could make a difference between modern and modernist. And
sure.
Yeah, that's probably something.
Well, it seems to me that basically I have tended to doubt the clarity, with the way in which the most popular of the art critics define postmodernism, often by things that are really were more common before them than they knew. Often their ignorance is what allowed them to imagine certain things. For example, Jameson, who was among the most ignorant of all of them, Jameson had no experience of the range of collage that existed from the early 20th century, like from 1912, from the Picasso Braque works to the present, because basically the notion of what he calls pastiche is only a derogatory term for collage. And my argument for collage was that, in radical coherence, my argument about collage is that I was attempting to show what it was like. And I used my mother as the example of a typical audience member confronted by a system that was essentially to be understood, but couldn't be understood because it was dissolving by things being sold off the shelves and no longer being where they would normally have been. So I'm dealing with that, and then I'm trying to say there are alternate systems for understanding, or agreement, or tuning, that collage can't give you. And collage can't give you what I call narrative. Of course, what I call narrative is not what everybody else calls narrative. So again, I seem to be in an escape mode. I mean, I define narrative very differently, and I regard my definition of narrative as important to my work as my definition of tuning. The notion of narrative I have is that I split narrative and story into two different cognitive modalities. Story I define as a sequence of events or parts of events that that determine a significant transformation. Now, it's the representation of that I'm talking about. In other words, that the narrative is not like a story. A story is the sequence of events and parts of events that generate a significant transformation. But narrative is the confrontation of a desiring subject with the threat or promise, or threat and promise of transformation, and the effort to either bring it about or hold it as status or fight it off. And I've used various examples to show how this is inevitably the case, that those two things are obviously not generated the same way. One is an internal structure of the relation of subjectivity to the panic that possible change could bring. The change that you most desire can wipe you out. That is to say, you can desire to become a king of a country that, by the time you become king, suddenly revolts and executes you as a tyrant. I mean, you may be aware that there's always a problem, that if you take this road, so to speak, to use this cross line, if you take this road, you're likely to get certain satisfactions out of it, but you're also likely to have your own being threatened by it. And the notion of story doesn't come with that package. It's not about the point of view. It's not about the internal representation of the difficulty of change. And change is an ontological problem. That is that you are something, or you're sort of are something. You're not something. You're something in the middle of change. I mean, we're transient steady state objects, and our transient steady state is what threatens us. Because because the one desire that everybody is afraid of, the one desire is that consciousness wishes to remain conscious, and that will not happen in the end. In the end, it will be gone. So, in effect, the greatest change is almost always death or annihilation, the annihilation of the subject. And the subject is always threatened by any transformation, even a small one. I decide to move to San Diego, and Ellie and I decide to go there. Ellie loses immediate contact with the New York art scene if she goes. She loses some connection to it, although she was still a young artist and could fashion, and she had to learn to fashion her art career from San Diego. which finally led to her doing sending the work by postcards. She did a work of 51 postcards over a 2-year period that she mailed out. That was a kind of adventure story of a hero called 100 Booths. And you saw 100 Booths going through different phases of his life, or his life, because they were male booths. And there was a kind of, I guess it was a kind of picaresque story, like on the road, that could be read from the pictures. She had to construct a career that began from that space, because she would move to San Diego, and she didn't know that at the time. I didn't know that I would be an art writer who was not really a reviewer. That is, I could be flown in to review, shows that they were paying me to review. The art news would often hire me to do major museum shows, because that I could do from a distance, but I couldn't do week in and week out reviewing, which I didn't want to do anyway. I never wrote straight reviews of anything. The review that Dominique was talking about, the review essay on Michael Fried's Absorption and Theatricality, was easy to do because it came in the form of a book, so I didn't have to leave San Diego to do it. Well, it was a great convenience to have a book. A book is mobile. I mean, itself may not be mobile, but you can carry it. And a lot of stuff you can transmit by means of new media communications. So my form of art criticism had to undergo a change from being on the scene to being apprehending the scene without being there, which was an interesting situation. I didn't find it hard. I also brought people in. So, like, I think I showed Keith Sonier, Richard Serra, and all sorts of other people back in '69, when they were just names that nobody knew. I showed post-pop representational people. So I put on shows, and I brought the artists to San Diego. So I found a way to solve a problem that I didn't think about when I first undertook the problem. I'd been offered other alternatives, but I didn't want. I thought it was time to leave New York, which is, I think, Spalding Gray called New York an offshore island, and I think he was quite right about it. That whatever it was like pretty offshore. Whereas California was leading the country, either over the cliff or back, and it wasn't entirely clear what it was doing, but it was a dominant influence that was beginning to really be felt. The Southern California sensibility was beginning to be really felt very powerfully by the '60s, and so it was interesting being there. Whereas earlier it was interesting being in New York. The New York, I was on the New York scene from about '57, through '68. And at '68, I had decided that conceptual art, the way they were defining it, had come to the end. It hadn't really. It got broader and more interesting in the '70s. So it wasn't exhausted. It's just that a particular type of conceptualism that the '60s brought in looked too narrow and too banal. The so-called Kossuth, Mel Bachner world, which I thought was not interesting at all. It was intelligent, but it wasn't interesting.
Should we take a break? I mean, we can continue talking over coffee, tea, and biscuits and chouquette. But if we want to come back afterwards and have a bit of time, we have until 5:15. So if we take a break now, and then we can start again at 4:15, we'll have an hour afterwards to continue the conversation. I mean, it's up to you, but you've been okay. Oh, it was a pleasure, and it's just.
As a craftsman, I believe in doing the complete work. I do as well as an artist. I do as well as I can.
Well, you're doing great. Thank you. I'm just going to make coffee.